Here we are on the last Sunday of the season of Epiphany. I would say here Ash Wednesday has come suddenly down upon us, but actually Ash Wednesday and of course Easter is sort of late this year. So we're well on into at least the first indications of spring before we start into Lent. I'd like to, the sermon today feels fairly simple, actually. I want to focus almost exclusively on the psalm. And then pair that with what we hear from the gospel in this story of the Transfiguration. And I'm glad, Val, thank you so much. Unintentionally, I guess, we didn't plan this, but I'm glad that we read the psalm together. And I'm going to go back and just read some portions of it again. Why are the nations in an uproar? Why do the peoples mutter empty threats? Why do the kings of the earth rise up in revolt and the princes plot together against the Lord and his anointed? It's no secret that the nations of the world, whether we're talking 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago or today, are in conflict. That's not news. It has been so always, and it continues to be so. We're now we're looking back 3,000 years or so, and we're hearing the nations are in an uproar against the Lord and his anointed. So this is speaking quite specifically from Israel's point of view. You might back away a little bit, and there are many ways of saying the nations of the world are not following the kinds of principles and spiritual principles and presence of God that actually lead to life. They're involved in something else. They're involved in something almost always more violent, almost always more acquisitive, almost always more self-interested. And so the nations fight, as we've been hearing in Paul recently, the way of the flesh, strife, enmity, quarreling, at the sort of personal level. But when we go to the national level, or the world of politics, it's nations fighting against one another because we're self-interested and acquisitive and violent. And this is portrayed as an offense against God, the anointed of Israel. And in just a moment, I want to say a little bit about this. You are my son. This day I have begotten you. We could spend some time on a kind of history of the way the Son of God is a term that has been applied variously to King David, the nation of Israel, some of the prophets, and the early Christian community took this symbol over of the Son of God and applied it to Jesus in a very specific way. But so this resistance of the nations is against God, and you get then a pretty, the term would be anthropomorphic. You get a very human-like picture of the God who is, he whose throne is in heaven is laughing. The Lord has them in derision. Then he speaks to them in his wrath, and his rage fills them with terror. And then later on, he says, "Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall crush them with an iron rod, and shatter them like a piece of pottery. And now, you kings, be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Submit to the Lord with fear, and with trembling bow before him, lest he be angry and you perish, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Happy are they all who take refuge in him." I read this psalm as at length. Because I want us to understand that the dream represented in this psalm has not died. The dream that is represented in this psalm is alive and is one of the major moving forces of world events right now. Whether it's whether it is an Islamic organization trying to establish a caliphate, or whether it's the American people partially enthralled by a strong man who promises victory and deliverance and strength. The image of breaking rules and being punished, and some human agency being the agent, being the instrument of reprisal. That dream is alive. And this vision of how reality unfolds guides more people on earth than probably any other. I want to be strong. I see my enemies. Is there any power that is going to deliver me from my enemies and from my distress? And the human temptation is always to think in terms of strength, in terms of violence, in terms of victory. And then you turn to Jesus, because these are the texts that formed the expectations for who Jesus was to be. And when there started to get be a buzz around Jesus, and there was the strength of his personality and the strength and the presence of his person began to be noticed. Of course, you hear all of these talk about Jesus as the Messiah. But when they thought of Messiah, then, as now, the psalm pretty much laid out a template for that. And of course, the psalm is just one of many texts. This is one of the visions, and it's central. It's central to our human experience. And, we hear it again today in the Transfiguration story. Tell no one about this until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Jesus was always telling his disciples, don't tell other people about me. And there are many reasons for that, perhaps, but one of the chief ones is, it's as if Jesus was saying, if you try to talk about me, they will misunderstand. They don't have a chance of understanding me as I proceed with my understanding of who God is. My understanding, says Jesus, of who God is. So that in the end, Jesus is not, wielding force against the powers of evil and destruction, but he allows himself to be crucified by them, saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He allows himself to be crucified, in a sense, in solidarity with all of the victims of the violence of the world. We are always meant to see both Jesus on the cross and Jesus as representative of the way the powers of the world work. And the way the powers of the world work is we don't want anything to do with this talk of love, this talk of peace, this talk of reconciliation, this talk of forgiveness. We want strength, we want power, we want victory. And Jesus would have none of that. People wanted him to be a king. They wanted him to throw the Roman occupying army out of Israel. They wanted political restoration. And the way of Jesus is simply radically different. Jesus does not hold with this notion of God. Watch out, because God's wrath is easily kindled. God's wrath is easily kindled, and then he will laugh you to scorn. He will break you like a piece of pottery. Did Jesus say that? You hear Jesus saying, watch out for God, because he's like a big bad dog that if you wake him up, you're going to get bit. And it's just not. So when we turn to the Transfiguration story, a couple of things. The last thing I would ever want to do is disparage or deny the reality of profound religious experiences. There must have been many times when the true significance of who Jesus was and is broke in upon the disciples, and they realized that they were in the presence of God. But the Transfiguration story, as we hear it, is a theological story, especially consonant with Matthew's aim to draw a relationship between Jesus and Moses. Jesus is the new lawgiver, but now you've got the prophets as well. So you've got on this Transfiguration story, you've got Moses, representative of the lawgiver, and you've got Elijah, representative of the prophets, and you've got Jesus there, kind of unemployed itinerant preacher saying, greater than Elijah, greater than Moses. It's a theological story. But the kicker is, this is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Which, of course, we don't, we haven't. I can't say we won't, because I'm not going to try to be determinative of the future, but we haven't. We listen to the dream of the psalm instead. We listen to the dream of the psalm. And as to alternatives to that, I can't say, do this, do this, do this, do this. I can say, listen to Jesus. You know, when I say, does it sound like Jesus when you hear these descriptions of God, a presence whose wrath is easily kindled and who will break us like pottery if he is displeased with us? Does that sound like the story of the prodigal son? Does that sound like any of the sort of parabolic actions of Jesus reaching out to the people that were judged to be worthless, sinful, marginal, outcast? We haven't listened to Jesus. We have followed the dream of victory. And whatever Jesus is about, he's about the ultimate triumph of God. But God and human victory are simply not on the same page. And when are we going to turn away from what we know does not work? This vision of the psalm doesn't work, especially when anybody thinks that they are going to be the human agency of this setting things to right. Oh, now I get to do this. I get to break the kings like pieces of pottery. And the Psalms are full of that. And that dream persists. And when will come the day when we set ourselves not to sort of redoubling our efforts to an old dream that has proven worthless time and time and time again, but turn our attention to what the gospel asks us to do today. Listen to him. Listen to him, and then day by day by day, at every different level, from the most intimate personal relationship you have with yourself to the broad sphere of human politics, what kind of guidance do we get from Jesus? How can we try to live in the world that he puts before us that does not operate on principles where violence is victorious and triumphs in the name of God? That is simply not Jesus. That's us. That's us, and we just come back over and over and over again to it. When are we going to start doing what the gospel says? This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him.